I love Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn are both two of my favorites. I like um yeah, it's hard not to like Randy Orton just for
Yeah.
good, solid, steady. Yeah, even John Cena. I love John Cena. I think he's one of the greatest wrestlers ever.
When Bret Hart says someone is the best ever, wrestling fans pay attention. Most people think Bret ranks wrestlers by championships. That is not true. His standards are completely different. That is why this list surprises almost everyone. Bret Hart has never published an official top 10 list. He has never sat down and written out 10 names in order. Instead, this ranking has been rebuilt using decades of his interviews, his memoir, and his own comments about the wrestlers who earned his respect. Some names on this list will feel obvious. Others will surprise you completely. A few legends that most fans expect are missing entirely, and their absence is just as deliberate as every name that does appear. That is because Bret does not judge wrestlers the way most fans do. Bret's memoir, Hitman: My Real Life in the Cartoon World of Wrestling, spends hundreds of pages laying out exactly why certain performers earned his respect, while others never came close. Reading between the lines of that book, along with years of interviews given long after his in-ring career ended, is really the only way to reconstruct a ranking Bret himself never bothered to formally write down. He talks about wrestling the way a craftsman talks about tools. Every performer either understood the job completely, or they did not, and there was very little room in his mind for anything in between. That mindset has stayed remarkably consistent, whether he is being interviewed by a wrestling podcast, a mainstream sports outlet, or a documentary crew, decades removed from his actual career. If you are new here, this channel digs deep into the real stories behind wrestling legends. Hit subscribe so you never miss one of these breakdowns, and stick around, because the order on this list might completely change how you see Bret Hart. Some fans expect names like Ric Flair or Hulk Hogan to sit near the top of any all-time list. You will not find either man occupying a spot on Bret's personal top 10 here, and that absence tells its own story. Bret has been openly critical of Hulk Hogan's leadership in the locker room over the years, and his long-running public back and forth with Ric Flair shows just how differently the two men saw the business. Bret was never interested in ranking legends by fame or by drawing power alone. He was interested in something much narrower and much harder to fake. Most fans judge a wrestler by how many titles they won. Bret judges a wrestler by something else entirely. To understand his list, you first need to understand how his mind works. Bret Hart grew up in Calgary, inside a wrestling family built by his father, Stu Hart. He trained in the basement of the family home, a place wrestlers came to call the dungeon. That upbringing shaped every single opinion he would ever have about the business. For Bret, wrestling was never just a show. It was a craft. It was something closer to stunt work than theater. And if you got it wrong, someone could get seriously hurt. That is why safety sits at the very top of Bret's list of priorities. Above everything else, a wrestler had to protect the person they were working with. Bret has been openly critical of performers who hurt their opponents for real, even by accident. He has pointed to Bill Goldberg's execution as the reason his own career ended, after a brutal concussion during a match at Starrcade in 1999. He has also criticized the modern star Gunther, telling him directly that stiff, unnecessary chops are lazy and unprofessional. To Bret, hurting someone for real is not toughness, it is a failure of skill. In Hart's philosophy, the safety of an opponent gets the highest importance. This stands in stark contrast to how the wrestling business usually measures success. Promoters have traditionally judged a wrestler by commercial numbers, things like gate receipts, pay-per-view buy rates, merchandise sales, and championship reigns. None of those numbers appear anywhere in Bret's personal grading system. A wrestler could sell out every arena in the country and still fail to make this list, and a wrestler who never held a single major championship could still land near the very top of it. That gap between how the industry measures greatness and how Bret measures it is the entire reason this list looks so different from any other countdown you might find online. Most fan-made lists lean heavily on nostalgia, on box office records, or on how a wrestler is remembered in highlight packages. Bret's list ignores almost all of that, which is exactly why a handful of the names on it will feel completely unfamiliar, even to lifelong fans of the sport. Right behind safety comes psychology. This means the story a match tells. A good wrestling match is not just a series of moves. It is a conversation between two bodies, building tension, building sympathy, and building towards a satisfying finish. Bret believes a wrestler without psychology is just doing gymnastics. Moves without meaning. Then comes realism. Bret wanted every strike, every fall, and every sell to look like it actually hurt. He hated anything that looked fake or cartoonish. And finally comes execution, the raw physical skill of hitting your marks cleanly and smoothly, without wasted movement. Put those four things together: safety, psychology, realism, and execution, and you have the lens Bret Hart uses to judge every wrestler he has ever stepped into a ring with. Now, let's count them down. Number 10 is Sweet Daddy Siki. Most modern fans have never heard this name, and that alone tells you something important about how Bret Hart builds his opinions. He does not care about modern fame. He cares about what shaped him personally. Reginald Siki wrestled under the name Sweet Daddy Siki, and he broke into the business in the 1950s and 1960s as one of the first African-American stars to become a genuine box office draw. He worked in a period when racism inside and outside the wrestling business made that path incredibly difficult. After moving permanently to Canada in December of 1956, Siki became a main event attraction in cities like Toronto and Montreal. In 1961, he even challenged Buddy Rogers for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, doing so while facing open protest from the Ku Klux Klan. Bret Hart has called Siki one of his favorite wrestlers of all time. When a young Bret was trying to figure out how to become a professional performer, it was Siki's bleached blonde hair, his colorful trunks, and his confident, self-assured persona, known to fans at the time as Mr. Irresistible, that gave him a blueprint. Siki proved that a wrestler could win over a crowd through charisma alone, before a single move was even thrown. That lesson stuck with Bret for the rest of his life. Some writers have even called Siki the Jackie Robinson of the wrestling industry, a nod to how much he broke down for the performers who came after him. Siki also went on to train future stars, including a young Adam Copeland, who the world would later know as Edge. When Siki passed away in late 2024 at the age of 91, Bret publicly called him the best wrestler he had ever seen during his own formative years. Most fans searching for a top 10 wrestling list expect the countdown to start with someone flashy, a big name from the current era, or a familiar face from the biggest shows of the 80s and 90s. Someone whose matches are still constantly replayed on modern highlight channels. Starting with Sweet Daddy Siki catches almost everyone off guard, and that is exactly the point. Bret is not building a list of the most famous wrestlers he has seen. He is building a list of the people who actually shaped how he sees the business, and fame was never part of that equation. Number 9 is Ted DiBiase. Ted DiBiase, known to most fans as the $1 Million Man, was trained by Dory Funk Jr. and Terry Funk, two names synonymous with classic, hard-nosed mat wrestling out of the old Amarillo territory. That training gave DiBiase a foundation in logical, believable storytelling, and it made him one of the finest technical heels the business has ever produced, winning championships across the NWA, Mid-South, and the WWF, over a career that spanned multiple decades and multiple regional promotions. Bret and DiBiase did not wrestle each other often, but the matches they did have are still remembered as clinics in old-school psychology. Their most notable outings came on Saturday Night's Main Event in 1991 and on Primetime Wrestling back in 1989. DiBiase himself has said that he and Bret came from the exact same school of psychology, sharing an almost identical idea of what a wrestling match should be. Their chemistry came from clean mat work and believable near falls rather than big spots or flashy moves. Their realism went even further than most fans realized. After a segment at Survivor Series in 1990, a visibly frustrated Bret swore under his breath after losing, a rare unscripted moment that made the whole exchange feel completely real. It is worth comparing DiBiase to a very different name from the same era, Bad News Brown, also known as Alan Coge. Coage was an Olympic bronze medalist in judo and a legitimately tough man, respected by everyone in the locker room, including Andre the Giant, who famously backed down from him during a confrontation on a tour bus. Coage carried a reputation for backing down from absolutely no one, on camera or off. Bret has called Coage honest to a fault, an honorable and disciplined man who never told a lie in his life. But Bret was far less kind about Coage's in-ring work, describing his style as stiff and selfish, a performer who took almost all the offense in a match and gave very little back. According to Bret, Coage would sell generously for a physical performer like the Dynamite Kid, but refused to extend Bret the same courtesy, which made their matches together feel choppy and draining rather than smooth. Bret even asked Vince McMahon directly not to book the two of them in a feud, a request that McMahon ignored almost immediately. Their personal rivalry became so public that at WrestleMania 4, Bret was involved in a moment where Coage's trophy from an earlier tournament victory was destroyed. A visual that captured just how much real tension existed between the two men outside the storyline itself. Bret respected Coage as a man completely. He did not respect him as a storyteller. That contrast shows exactly how Bret separates personal character from professional skill, something that comes up again and again on this list. Most fans would never think to put Ted DiBiase this high on a favorites list. He was rarely presented as a top-level singles champion in the WWF, and his flashy million-dollar man character often gets remembered more for his money and his laugh than for his in-ring craft, since his run as a manager and mouthpiece in his later WWF years overshadowed the technical wrestler he had been for most of his career. But Bret is not grading DiBiase on how he was booked. He is grading him on the quality of the storytelling the two of them built together whenever they actually shared a ring, and by that measure, DiBiase belongs exactly where he sits. Number 8 is Roddy Piper. Roddy Piper is remembered by most fans for his chaotic brawling style and his legendary talking ability on the microphone, the kind of natural charisma that made Piper's Pit one of the most talked about wrestling segments of its era. But Bret's respect for Piper came from something much more personal. Throughout his career, Piper had a strict policy of protecting his character, rarely agreeing to lose cleanly in the middle of the ring. That policy was set aside at WrestleMania Fee in 1992, when Piper was defending the WWF Intercontinental Championship against Bret. In an iconic passing of the torch moment, Piper allowed himself to be pinned, directly elevating Bret into the upper level of the singles division. It was a moment built entirely on trust between two performers, since Piper had spent years protecting that same title reputation from clean losses. Bret has repeatedly said that Piper was one of the most important figures in his entire career. It was not just about that one match. Bret has praised Piper's leadership in the locker room and his willingness to give up his own protected spot to help someone else succeed, calling it something that did more for his career than almost anyone else in the business, Harley Race included. Casual fans remember Piper mostly for his mouth, for chasing Hulk Hogan around arenas, and for the chaos he could create with a single interview segment, an image that has followed him through decades of highlight reels and retrospective documentaries. Very few fans think of him as someone who quietly shaped Bret's career through a single selfless decision inside a ring. That is exactly why Bret ranks him this high. Piper's greatest gift to Bret had nothing to do with charisma at all. Number 7 is The Undertaker. Mark Calloway, better known as The Undertaker, occupies a unique spot in Bret's story. Before working closely with Bret in 1996 and 1997, The Undertaker had mostly been booked in short, attraction-style matches against larger, less mobile opponents. Matches built more around his supernatural gimmick than any real competitive structure. Bret played a direct role in changing that. Working with Bret showed the wrestling world that The Undertaker could hold his own in long, technical, main event caliber matches. Their encounter at SummerSlam in 1997 is often cited by both men as a personal favorite. The Undertaker has expressed real gratitude to Bret for giving him the chance to prove he could actually wrestle, rather than simply play a larger-than-life character built around size and menace alone. He has described The Undertaker as the true leader and moral voice of the locker room, a rare thing in an industry full of enormous egos. After the fallout from the Montreal Screwjob, it was The Undertaker who confronted Vince McMahon directly on Bret's behalf, a gesture that cemented a bond between the two men that lasted the rest of their careers. Fans who only know The Undertaker from his supernatural gimmick and his enormous size might not expect Bret to rank him this highly on a list built around realism and psychology, especially given how different their two in-ring styles appeared on the surface. But Bret saw something different backstage, a performer willing to slow down, adapt, and prove himself in a completely different kind of match than the one he was known for. Popularity never factored into this ranking. Trust did. Number 6 is Harley Race. Where Siki gave Bret a lesson in showmanship, Harley Race gave him a lesson in toughness. Race was an 8-time NWA World Heavyweight Champion, famous for his old-school toughness, his peerless ring generalship, and his commitment to a believable, physical style built on old-school codes of conduct both inside the ring and in the locker room. For years he worked as a traveling champion, defending his title against the top babyface in every territory he visited. Bret's admiration for Race came from that authenticity. Race, for his part, once said a young Bret Hart was as good as it got. Their careers rarely crossed in a televised singles match, since Race was a veteran WWF star while Bret was still working as part of the Hart Foundation tag team alongside Jim Neidhart. spending those years chasing tag titles rather than a single spotlight. Even so, Bret often pointed to Race's leadership in the locker room and his flawless execution as the benchmark every champion should aim for. To Bret, Race represented a generation of wrestlers whose work carried absolutely no trace of fakery, forged by years of defending a championship against a different local hero in a different city almost every single night. Decades later, the two men have remained close, appearing together at conventions and fan events long after both of their in-ring careers ended, a friendship built on that same mutual respect rather than any shared storyline, and one that has continued well past the point where either man had anything left to gain from staying in touch professionally. Younger fans might not recognize Harley Race's name at all, since most of his championship reigns happened long before cable television turned wrestling into a global product. Bret does not care about that gap in recognition. To him, Race represents a kind of old-school credibility that most modern audiences never got the chance to witness firsthand, and that makes his inclusion here less about nostalgia and more about respect for a standard that rarely gets acknowledged anymore. That's the halfway point. 5 names down, 5 to go, and this is where the list starts to get personal. So far, every wrestler on this countdown has earned their spot through a single defining trait, whether that was showmanship, toughness, or quiet leadership. From here on, the names get closer to Bret's own heart, and the reasons behind each ranking get a little harder to separate from his own life story. Number 5 is Curt Hennig, known to the world as Mr. Perfect. Curt Hennig is a name Bret brings up again and again when talking about pure technical wrestling. Their matches at SummerSlam in 1991 and the King of the Ring tournament in 1993 are still remembered as some of the finest technical contests of that entire era, built on crisp matwork rather than the muscle-bound spectacle that defines so much of that same period of wrestling history. To Bret, Hennig was the perfect opponent because they shared the exact same ring psychology. Both men could work a fast, fluid, athletic style built on logical transitions and high-impact offense, all executed without ever putting the other person in real danger. Their matches together became proof that a great story could be built through clean athletic competition alone, without relying on brawling or over-the-top theatrics, and their SummerSlam 1991 encounter for the Intercontinental Championship is still held up today as one of the finest pure technical matches of that entire decade. Notably, Hennig also protected Bret through a real back injury during one of their matches, something Bret never forgot. Fans often remember Curt Hennig for his cocky Mr. Perfect gimmick and his talent for trash talk, rather than for the technical depth of his in-ring work, since his character was built around bragging about being flawless at everything, rather than his actual mat skills. Bret sees it the opposite way around. To him, the gimmick was just decoration on top of some of the smoothest, safest, and most cleanly executed matches of that entire decade. And that is why Hennig sits comfortably inside his top 5. Number 4 is Shawn Michaels. This is the name most fans expect to see missing entirely, given the real-life hostility between the two men. The rivalry between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels is one of the most talked-about conflicts in wrestling history, culminating in the Montreal Screwjob in 1997, an incident where Bret was pinned using a finish he never agreed to, in his own home country, during what was supposed to be his final match for the company. And yet, despite years of genuine personal anger, Bret's professional opinion of Michaels' in-ring ability has never changed. Bret has repeatedly called Michaels one of the greatest in-ring performers to ever live, praising his athleticism, his work ethic, and his ability to create real drama inside the ring, through high-drama, theatrical pacing that few other performers could match. His frustration over the Montreal incident was never really about Michaels' talent. It came from the feeling that the two of them still had several classic matches left to give the fans, matches that never got the chance to happen. This is the clearest example of something that defines Bret's entire philosophy. He is able to completely separate a person's character from their skill as a performer. He can dislike the man and still respect the wrestler, and he has said so publicly more than once, even years after their rivalry ended. If you asked most fans to predict this list, Shawn Michaels would probably be the very first name they crossed off, given everything that happened between the two men, from the Montreal Screwjob itself to years of public sniping that followed it in the years afterward. Seeing him ranked this high is meant to be uncomfortable. It is meant to make you stop and think about the difference between liking someone and respecting their work, because Bret clearly draws that line far more sharply than most people ever could. Number 3 is Steve Austin. The rivalry between Bret Hart and Stone Cold Steve Austin, running through 1996 and 1997, is widely seen as the spark that lit the fuse on the entire Attitude Era. Bret personally picked Austin as his opponent for Survivor Series in 1996, recognizing something special in the younger Texan's psychological instincts. That feud reached its peak in their submission match at WrestleMania 13, a match remembered for its now famous double turn. There was no color policy in effect that night, yet Austin ended up bleeding heavily by the finish. The match ended with a blood-covered Austin refusing to give up, passing out inside Bret's sharpshooter rather than tapping. That moment worked because Bret personally cut Austin during the match himself, taking on the risk to create maximum drama while protecting Austin from any real danger, a decision that meant Bret carried the physical and legal risk of blading rather than leaving it to Austin or to any outside official. Austin's stubborn refusal to quit had actually cost him a match against Bret at Survivor Series just months earlier, when it was presented as a weakness in a match built on traditional wrestling logic and tactical countermoves. At WrestleMania, the exact same trait was flipped into his greatest strength. Austin has said many times that his rise to superstardom would not have happened without Bret's guidance and his total willingness to pass the torch, and Bret himself has said he was not going to let anyone else steal that position away from Austin. Most fans already assume Steve Austin belongs somewhere near the top of Bret's list, since their WrestleMania 13 match is widely considered one of the greatest of all time and gets replayed constantly whenever fans debate the best matches in wrestling history. What surprises people is why Bret rates him so highly. It is not the blood, and it is not the beer that would come to define Austin's career soon after. It is the trust the two men built long before that match ever happened. Number 2 is the Dynamite Kid, real name Thomas Billington. Despite the fact that Bret and Billington had a serious personal falling out later in life, following some hurtful comments in Billington's autobiography, a falling out that never fully healed before Billington's passing, Bret has never backed away from calling him, pound for pound, the greatest wrestler who ever lived. Billington's influence on the business was enormous. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, his work in Stampede Wrestling, and later in New Japan Pro Wrestling, introduced a level of physical intensity and aerial innovation the industry had never seen before, a style that was stiff, yet still tightly controlled inside the ring. His legendary matches against Tiger Mask helped create the entire template for what we now call junior heavyweight and cruiserweight wrestling around the world. Bret's own focus on crisp execution, powerful suplexes, and a relentless pace can be traced directly back to Billington's influence. Dynamite Kid proved that a smaller wrestler could carry main event level credibility through sheer physical intensity and flawless technique, and that lesson shaped Bret more than almost anyone else on this list, aside from one final name. Casual fans in North America may barely recognize the Dynamite Kid at all, since so much of his most influential work happened in Stampede Wrestling and in Japan, far away from the biggest stages of American television, and largely undocumented on the kind of footage that circulates widely today. That obscurity makes his number 2 spot one of the most surprising choices on the entire list. But it also proves how little mainstream exposure ever mattered to Bret when he was deciding who truly earned his respect. And that brings us to number 1, Owen Hart. Owen was not just Bret's younger brother, he was also, in Bret's own words, one of the best and most naturally gifted wrestlers he ever stepped into a ring with. Their sibling rivalry throughout 1994 produced matches that are still studied today as masterclasses in competitive storytelling, beginning with their opening match at WrestleMania 10, a match many historians consider the single greatest opening match in the history of the entire event, and building all the way to their 5-star steel cage match at SummerSlam that same year. What made their chemistry so special was a lifetime of shared history. They had grown up training together in their father's dungeon, learning every one of each other's strengths and weaknesses from childhood, absorbing the same family lessons about safety and realism from the very beginning. That shared knowledge let them execute high-risk moves with a level of precision and safety that almost no other pairing in wrestling history could match. Owen had the rare gift of generating real heat as a villain, while never once compromising on safety. And to Bret, that combination represented the absolute peak of everything the Hart family had built inside that basement gym. When Bret talks about the wrestler who meant the most to him, professionally and personally, it always comes back to his brother. Plenty of fans would have guessed Owen belonged somewhere on this list, given how famous their family feud became in 1994, and how frequently it still gets replayed in wrestling documentaries decades later. Fewer would have guessed he sits at the very top, ahead of legends like Shawn Michaels, Steve Austin, and even the Dynamite Kid, a man Bret has called pound for pound the greatest ever. But numbers and legacy were never really the point for Bret. Trust was, and no one on earth had earned more of Bret's trust inside a wrestling ring than his own brother. So there is the list, but Bret Bret's story does not end in the 1990s. Before moving on, it helps to step back and see the pattern running underneath every single name so far. A typical fan poll would almost certainly put championship reigns first, star power second, and in-ring chemistry somewhere further down the list, if it appears at all. Bret's list flips that completely. Siki earns his spot through charisma and character work, rather than titles. Race and DiBiase earn theirs through believable, methodical mat work, rather than flashy spots. Piper and The Undertaker earn theirs through selfless leadership, rather than personal glory. And Michaels, despite years of real animosity, earns his spot purely because Bret refuses to let personal feelings distort his judgment of raw skill. Even his brief crossover with Terry Funk at an ECW event in 1997, a rare meeting between two very different wrestling territories, was built on mutual generational respect rather than spectacle. Funk had spent his own career built around a similarly stubborn, hard-nosed philosophy, coming out of the Amarillo territory the same way Bret came out of Calgary, and their one-off encounter blended those two very different regional styles into something that still gets talked about by fans who witnessed it. That consistency, applied the same way whether Bret loved or hated the person across the ring from him, is what makes his opinions so difficult to argue with. It is worth pausing here to talk about who did not make this list, because the absences say just as much as the names themselves. Bill Goldberg never appears, and Bret has been blunt about why, directly blaming Goldberg's execution for a severe concussion that helped end his own in-ring career at Starrcade in 1999. Gunther, one of the most dominant modern champions in the entire industry, also never appears, since Bret has criticized his stiff chops to his face, arguing that hurting an opponent for real is lazy rather than impressive. Even bigger names like Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan, wrestlers most fans would automatically place inside any all-time top 10, are nowhere to be found. Bret's long-running public disagreements with Flair and his criticism of Hogan's locker room leadership made both men impossible to include under his own standards, no matter how much commercial success either man achieved. To Bret, none of that success matters if the fundamentals of safety and psychology are missing. It is a genuinely uncomfortable position to take in an industry that so often celebrates box office numbers above everything else. But Bret has never shown any interest in softening it just to make his list more agreeable. After his career as an active wrestler ended, Bret stayed close to the business as an observer, and he found a handful of modern stars who carried his same principles forward, even though none of them make his official top 10. That alone sets Bret apart from a lot of other retired legends, plenty of whom fade quietly into nostalgia and stop paying close attention to the current product. Bret kept watching, kept forming opinions, and kept applying the exact same standard he built decades earlier, inside his father's basement. The first is CM Punk. Bret has called CM Punk his all-time favorite wrestler of the last 20 years, describing him as an innovator who thinks differently from everyone around him, someone who brings fresh ideas and real grit into every promo and every match, standing apart from the more homogenized, heavily scripted style that has come to define much of modern wrestling television. Some critics have called Punk's in-ring style sloppy compared to classically trained technicians, but Bret sees that roughness as an asset rather than a flaw. To him, it makes Punk's matches feel like an actual struggle instead of a rehearsed performance. Just as importantly, Bret has praised Punk as a genuinely safe worker, drawing a clear line between his careful execution and the kind of dangerous, careless style that Bret has never had any patience for throughout his career. Modern audiences might expect Bret to dismiss Punk entirely, given how far removed Punk's promo style and independent wrestling roots are from the classic territory system Bret came up in, a system built on regional loyalty rather than the kind of national, corporate wrestling machine Punk eventually rose through. Instead, Bret has embraced him as the one performer from the last 2 decades who genuinely reminds him of himself, someone stubborn enough to do things his own way, regardless of what the rest of the industry expected. The second is Rey Mysterio. Bret has openly said that his biggest regret from his time in WCW was never getting the chance to wrestle Rey Mysterio, a period when Bret was mostly underused and booked as a villain. Bret has said that if he could choose just one opponent from wrestling history, it would be Mysterio. He has called him one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, placing him in the same conversation reserved for the very best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. Bret has imagined exactly how that match would have gone, picturing himself as a grounded, methodical veteran trying to slow down and dismantle a high-flying underdog, a clash of styles he believes could have produced something truly special, a genuine meeting between old-school realism and a completely different, high-flying tradition built on speed rather than strength. It might seem strange that a wrestler so devoted to grounded, mat-based realism would name a high-flying luchador as his dream opponent, especially given how different Mysterio's entire style was from the classic Calgary school Bret came up in. But that is exactly the kind of contrast Bret finds most compelling. He was never against athleticism itself. He was only ever against athleticism used without any storytelling behind it. And Mysterio built an entire career proving those two things could exist together. None of these choices make sense if you are judging wrestling the way most fans judge it, through championships, merchandise sales, or crowd pops. They only make sense once you understand that Bret was always measuring something else entirely, something closer to trust than to fame. It is a strange, narrow way to rank a wrestling career, and it is exactly why nobody else in the entire history of the business has ever produced a list quite like it. That is also why so many current stars still measure themselves against him. When a young wrestler today wants to prove they belong in the conversation about the best pure technical performers alive, journalists and fans alike still reach for the same comparison, asking whether they can hang with Bret Hart's standard. Decades after his retirement, that standard has not moved an inch, and very few performers in wrestling history can say the same about the legacy they left behind. Promotions change hands, television deals come and go, and entire generations of fans grow up and move on. Yet the same handful of questions keep getting asked about every new star who claims to be a great technical wrestler, and Bret's name is almost always the yardstick used to answer them. In the end, this list says more about Bret Hart than it does about any of the wrestlers on it. It shows a man who built his entire career around protecting the people he stepped into a ring with, and who never once stopped believing that wrestling, done right, is one of the most demanding and honest art forms in all of sport. Bret Hart built his reputation one match at a time, protecting every opponent who ever trusted him, and asking for nothing less in return. That, more than any championship he ever held, is the legacy he seems most determined to leave behind, and it is a standard that will likely outlast every title reign, every record, and every headline he ever generated during his time in the ring.